Hello again, everyone. Thank you again for joining today. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Meg Gibbon, and I'm Switchboard's Program Officer for Learning and Knowledge Management. To start, I want to inform everyone on the line that today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Switchboard website very soon. You will receive an email with the link to the recording directly after this webinar, and that's where you'll be able to find that once it goes up. I'm really excited to be presenting this topic today on strengthening refugee integration through community resource mapping. This training is presented by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. Switchboard is supported by the Office of Refugee Resettlement and implemented by the IRC. And the IRC has partnered with LIRS to provide employment-related training and technical assistance. I'd also like to ask everyone on the call today that if you're presenting in this training with more than one colleague, but you are using a single computer, if you can please type your names and organization into the chat just so that we know who's joining, that would be great. Let's go over a few items in WebEx before we dive into the content. If you're using the phone audio today, you can click the icon in the upper left corner at any time to find the dial-in number and code. I also dropped that into the chat a little bit earlier on. If you don't see this icon, click anywhere on the main webinar screen and that should appear. We'd really love to hear from you throughout today's training. Please type any comments and questions that you have into the chat, and we'll respond to those during Q&A. If you don't see the chat bubble icon on your screen, again, just click anywhere on the screen that should appear for you. You click that chat bubble as shown on the screen here, and the chat window will appear. One thing to note is to please send your message to all participants so that we can all view the comment that you've entered in. And lastly, I want to mention that during Q&A, if you would like to speak aloud and have us unmute your mic, you can click the small hand icon at the bottom right, quite a small icon. You have to squint to see that, but it's a little hand, and we will be able to unmute your line after that, and you can speak a question aloud. As I mentioned, my name is Meg Gibbon, but from here I'm going to hand it over to today's speaker, Sarah Krause, to introduce herself and today's objectives.
Thanks, Meg, and hello, everyone. Again, my name is Sarah Krause, and give me just one moment. Apologies for that delay. I'm a consultant specializing in refugee and immigrant services, and I have worked with refugees for nearly 20 years, including 8 years at the local affiliate level and 5 years as Senior Director for Programs with a National Resettlement Agency headquarters. I now have the very good fortune of being able to provide service to agencies like yours who are seeking to better respond to the needs of refugees and other immigrant populations in your communities. Today, we're going to focus on community resource mapping as a means of strengthening refugee integration. By the end of our time together, it's my hope that you will be able to identify the advantages of community resource mapping, describe how to determine which community resources may be of greatest benefit to those you serve, and list effective strategies to identify and map these resources in your communities. Apologies. So really, before we get started, I think it's important that we agree on a definition of refugee integration. Refugee integration is most frequently defined as a dynamic, two-way process in which refugees and the receiving society work together to build secure, vibrant, and cohesive communities. Refugee integration cannot be accomplished by refugees alone, nor can it be accomplished by the receiving communities. It must be done with both parties together. In the Refugee Integration Survey and Evaluation RISE Year 5 final report 10 integration pathways were identified, and these pathways include employment and economic self-sufficiency, education and training, children's education, health and physical well-being, housing, social bonding, social bridging, language and cultural knowledge, safety and stability, and civic engagement. So now we'd like to ask a quick true-false question. True or false, with enough funding, an agency can meet all of its clients' needs? And you can just type true or false into the chat box and send to all participants.
So I'm starting to see some answers come in. Thanks everyone for participating in this question. It looks like a unanimous false from the audience today.
I am thrilled to hear that, everyone. That's exactly right. While additional funding can help us to identify and respond to the needs of our clients, there is not sufficient funding available to meet all of their needs. Even agencies that consider themselves to be full service or one-stop shops must connect clients with other community resources in order for the clients to achieve integration. There's an African proverb, and this seems appropriate right now as I'm speaking with you all from Uganda. There's an African proverb that says, "It takes a village to raise a child." This concept can be applied to refugee integration as well. It takes a village or a community to facilitate refugee integration. There is no one agency, institution, or individual that can do this alone. So what exactly is community resource mapping? Community resource mapping is the process of identifying and aligning assets within a defined area to accomplish stated objectives. It is often referred to as well as community asset mapping. So what is a community resource or a community asset? A community resource is anything that can be used to improve the quality of life. Again, that is anything that can be used to improve the quality of life. And that's something for us to keep in mind as we move forward. Here are some examples of community resources. I'm going to highlight just a few of them. So as we look at the resource of individuals, this could include those that you serve, and quite frankly, it should. Think about all of the client strengths that you identified in your strengths-based case management work. These same strengths may be assets to your community. Organizations and institutions, these don't need to be those with whom you typically work, although they certainly could be. As we look at the concept of intersectionality, there are other organizations and institutions that may have interests that are aligned with ours that don't necessarily serve our same populations. Businesses is another example of a community resource, and these aren't just those that employ our clients, but those that sell to them, those that want to support refugee work, and those that care about other issues that, again, intersect with the issues that impact our clients. Physical structures is another one to highlight. Physical structures could be things like playgrounds or resource centers. And networks obviously is a very macro level resource, but networks could be things like insurance networks. These are things that could be of benefit to our clients. So why map our community resources? What are the advantages? Firstly, community resource mapping supports the engagement of community members. Many of us have been contacted by those wishing to respond to the refugee crisis, but we don't always have volunteer opportunities in which to engage them. Through community resource mapping, we can identify the assets that they have to support us in accomplishing our shared objectives. Some of the assets that they have may surprise you. Secondly, community resource mapping supports the cultivation of partnerships around common objectives. Thirdly, community resource mapping supports the coordination of services, which can both minimize unnecessary overlap and address any gaps that we might identify. And finally, and perhaps ultimately, community resource mapping supports client access to resources. So we have another poll question. Choose your answer, then click submit. Has your organization attempted a community resource mapping exercise? A, yes, B, no, C, unsure. And you'll see the poll question to your right.
Great, so I can see several responses coming in over that poll. I'll leave that open for just a few more seconds to allow everyone to make their choice and then close and share the results.
Thanks.
Okay, so I am closing that up now and giving people just one more moment for the in-progress respondents. And I'll share those results. So those should have just come up for everyone. Pretty split, with 19 saying yes, 17 saying no, and 30 saying unsure.
Wow, great. Okay, that's really helpful. For those of you that have participated in a community resource mapping exercise, this slide should look somewhat familiar. For those of you that aren't sure if you've engaged in a community resource mapping exercise, this may help you determine if that's happened or if at least one stage of that process has happened. So there are essentially 6 stages to a community resource mapping exercise. The first stage is pre-planning. The second, the actual planning. Third, information gathering. Fourth, analyzing. Fifth, monitoring and evaluation. And finally, 6th, sharing. For each of these stages, we've developed templates to guide you. A link to this new Switchboard tool that we are very excited about will be emailed to you after this training. And you can see an example of that tool here. The first stage is pre-planning, and that's what to consider before you get started. One of the first things that you want to ask yourself is, has this been attempted before? Has anyone taken on a community resource mapping exercise in your community? If so, what were the results and what can we learn from that attempt? If possible, I would recommend reaching out to the facilitator of that effort. They may be willing to speak with your group about some of the lessons that they learned. Along those same lines, there are other partners in the community who might be interested in joining the exercise, and this is a time that you might want to start thinking about them. One way that you can find out about that is to ask at your quarterly consultations. Yet another good reason to participate in those quarterly consultations. Finally, think about what time and financial resources are needed to take on a community resource mapping exercise. Be really honest in your
Sarah, it sounds like your audio may have just cut out. Do you mind repeating that last item?
Not at all. So finally, you want to think about what time and financial resources are needed to take on a community resource mapping exercise. You want to be really honest in your assessment. Once you have a sense of this, consider contacting your local foundations or municipal offices to discuss their interest in need for mapping. They might be willing to commission you to take on a mapping effort that will meet their and your needs. If this isn't possible, ask if there's another organization that would share in the expense. It's very likely that you have similar needs and could both benefit from this work. the next phase is the planning phase, and these are things that you want to do before you begin the mapping exercise. It's time really at this point to move forward in your planning. And one of the first things that you want to do is create a task force. This goes beyond identifying those that might be interested in a community resource mapping exercise and focuses on those who will be actively involved. Identify roles for all of those that will be involved, including who will serve as the task force's convener. This is an especially challenging role and should be someone who's up to the task. They should have the necessary time available and have community's trust. Depending on the situation, you might consider a former client. Second, you want to set a vision or overarching goal that relates to one of the 10 integration pathways that we discussed earlier. The goal really should be broad and aspirational, one that the task force can't achieve on its own. And then finally, establish SMART objectives that support you in accomplishing your vision and ultimately facilitating refugee integration. You want to keep in mind that different objectives will require different community resources. Also keep in mind that your objectives really do need to be SMART. And I'm sure that most of you are aware of this already, but just as a reminder, SMART objectives are those that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And you want to identify indicators to help you measure your objectives. So now we're going to move on to an example. I think, or at least I hope, that this will be especially useful to you all. In this case, let's say that our vision is that refugees resettled within the city of Chicago are mentally, physically, and emotionally well. Again, this is a broad vision and something that can't be achieved by our task force alone. Of the 10 integration pathways that we discussed earlier, this goal might relate to health and physical well-being and or social bonding and bridging pathways. I also want to note that we've identified our geographic area of focus as the city of Chicago. Defining your community is really of critical importance in community resource mapping exercises. Without defining your geographic area, it can get quite overwhelming. So a SMART objective related to this vision may be this. By the end of 2020, refugees served by our partnering organizations have access to culturally and linguistically appropriate psychosocial support services. One way we might measure our progress towards this objective is by setting a target of 2 new referral partnerships developed with local psychosocial support providers within 6 months. Okay, so now that we have our SMART objective, we can determine what community resources to map. And here's our discussion question. And type your response in the chat message you can send to all participants. Again, the question is, what community resources might be needed to accomplish this objective? What community resources might be needed to accomplish this objective? And again, here is that objective. By the end of 2020, refugees served by our partnering organizations have access to culturally and linguistically appropriate psychosocial support services. And again, just enter your responses in the chat box.
So I'm seeing a response here from Andrea, who said mental health providers.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrea.
Rebecca mentioned accessible and affordable translation services.
Very good.
Allison, mentioned counseling centers. Tammy mentioned support groups. Katie mentioned healthcare clinics and hospitals. Yana mentioned ESL classes. Let's see, seeing a few mentions of transportation, interpretation, daycare, cultural liaisons. A lot of great responses coming through.
Yeah.
I would encourage everyone to read through the responses in the chat from your colleagues as well.
That's fantastic. I'm very impressed by those responses, and really you all are spot on. As a reminder, a community resource is anything that improves the quality of life, anything. So we are right in saying that we need mental health providers, but we are also correct in saying that we need public transportation to those providers, interpreters, cultural brokers, insurance networks within network providers that meet our standards. You might even say yoga studios. It all depends on what it is that you think will ultimately help you accomplish that SMART objective. And it's important to really think in broad categories so that you can eventually narrow it down to those individual supports. Okay, so now that we have our vision and our objective set, we'll need to determine how we're going to gather information. We'll want to select a mapping system and then agree on how that information will be shared. And we'll talk about each of these things in the coming slides. The first here is information gathering, figuring out what's out there. This, as you can imagine, can be a daunting task, but it is less daunting when you establish an objective so that you're not looking at all resources that exist within a community, but rather all resources that exist within a community that will help us to achieve our SMART objectives. Some strategies that you can use in identifying available community resources. Depending on the SMART objective set and the types of resources needed to accomplish those objectives, you may utilize different methods for collecting information. These methods may include, but aren't limited to, community scans, and I've noted specifically here on this slide through quarterly consultations, although you certainly don't need to limit yourself to that. Online research, including through sites like the Refugee Center online, site visits to cross-sector partners like community centers or public libraries, and meetings with groups like your local Chamber of Commerce and city officials. And other strategies include interviews with faith communities or houses of worship. Obviously, you can interview other groups as well. One of the reasons why I thought an interview process might work especially well with faith communities or houses of worship is that a faith community or house of worship may be comprised of many individuals with connections to those other community resources that we talked about. They may oversee a local business association or work in the public transportation system or have connection to individuals that speak other languages. And having a face-to-face interview with a group like this, you can begin to uncover all of the resources that may exist within that one broader category of house of worship. And then finally, another strategy to identify available community resources is surveys to area stakeholders. And as you all are probably aware, there are a number of ways in which you can do surveys for free, including those through SurveyMonkey or through Google Forms. And some of those same platforms also allow you to analyze your data. And speaking of analyzing your data, this is really a very critical step in the community resource mapping process. This is where you are quite literally laying it all out. As part of your analysis, you'll want to lay out your resources via both spreadsheet and map, so that you can identify gaps or overlaps in resources, issues of accessibility, such as linguistically appropriate mental health service provider that maybe doesn't accept insurance, and or areas where there aren't currently refugee populations, but where resources would support the establishment of new communities. I know that this isn't as great an issue as it has been in years past, but this is something that many of us were looking at when the number of refugees arriving through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program was exceptionally high. Of course, on a very practical level, laying your resources out on a map can make those resources accessible to pre-literate and non-literate populations. I think at times we rely on the translation of resources and don't give as much thought to those refugees who are not yet literate in their own language or don't have a written language on which to rely. And I'm going to leave this particular slide up for a bit so that you can maybe jot some of these things down. Of course, you'll also have access to this following the webinar, but I wanted to make certain that we provided you with some practical mapping tools that could help you in your community resource mapping exercise. The first mapping tool that's listed here is Airtable. And one of the things that I like about Airtable is that it also operates as a kind of spreadsheet and allows you to group many of your findings. I'm sure many of you are, probably everyone is familiar with Google Maps. Google Maps is a great way to define the area in which you're working and to do some light online research. Data USA has a lot of information that's already been compiled, and so is not only an effective mapping tool, but can also be a useful resource in the collection of information. And actually, while I don't have a slide related to this, if there are other mapping tools that you all like and have used in the past, please feel free to type those tools into your chat box now. And my thanks again to those of you that responded to the survey in advance. We got a few of these mapping tools from you all then. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Allison. All right. So we want to continue on in talking about the analyzing of our community resources. As you analyze your resources, it's important that you consider, first of all, your original vision, as well as your SMART objectives and outcomes. Are the resources gathered supporting you in accomplishing those things? If not, it may be best to catalog those resources, but not spend your time and energy in exploring them further. Consider your pathways, your pathways to integration. Do these resources move you and those you serve further down that pathway? Does it make sense if you look at another pathway, if it perhaps is a greater priority? When you look at areas of overlap, what can be done about those? Should resources be consolidated? Is it possible that one provider should consider a different geographic area of service? Of course, that's a very difficult conversation into which you might enter, but the mapping of the resources can help to make that case. How can gaps in services be better addressed? Might this mapping exercise demonstrate a need to funders that you really had trouble demonstrating in the past? If your mapping has revealed additional partners in the space, consider what barriers may exist to that coordination. Those barriers could be geographic, it could be funding, it could even be personality driven. But you want to make certain that you're thinking through all of these things as you look at the resources that you have identified and how you might support your clients in accessing those services. Once you've identified all of those issues and opportunities, list them, and then note the recommended actions. Take the time to identify individuals responsible to follow up and assign some due dates. This is really where the rubber hits the road. It's great to know what resources are out there, but community resource mapping really should move us beyond the identification of resources and towards an analysis of how those resources can be used. If you find the resources and can't use them, it's not an effective exercise. And I want to just take a moment now to apologize for any background noise. Hopefully it's not overwhelming to folks. The next phase, and this is the fifth phase, is monitoring and evaluation. This is where we're asking ourselves, are we really accomplishing what we had set out to do? It's great to note that we have followed up on all of those action items and we have done them by the due date set, but we want to move beyond that to determine if our SMART objectives are being accomplished. One of the ways that we can determine if our SMART objectives have been accomplished is by leaning on the indicators. And this is something that I think Switchboard has done a really great job in sharing with folks. Indicators is really how you're going to measure your objectives. And if we were to go back to our previous slide, you would see that we were looking at how many new connections that we were going to make with psychosocial service providers. And we wanted to make 2 new referral connections within 6 months. Our baseline is 0 then, so we need to establish our baseline. That's 0. Then we want to make certain that we're moving forward. Throughout that process, reevaluate your SMART objectives and indicators to confirm that they're still appropriate, that they still make sense. Things change over time, especially when you have an objective that is a little further out, like ours that said by the end of 2020. Measure your midpoint progress. I would suggest if your indicator was set for 6 months, check in at 3 to see where you're at. Hopefully you have already established a referral relationship with at least 1 new provider. And then of course you want to report at the end of that 6-month period, and hopefully you will have had 2 referral relationships that have been established. There are obviously other ways that you can monitor and evaluate your progress. One way that you might do this is through survey. You could also look at doing a focus group and or individual or group interviews. I would recommend that you do this not only as you are monitoring your movement towards an accomplished objective, but also as you evaluate the process, community resource mapping process itself. As a best practice, share the feedback you received with relevant stakeholders. Then I would suggest that you look at sharing, and this is communicating throughout the process. As you're sharing, you want to consider a number of things here. One is when, at the beginning, the middle, or the end, or ideally, it's at the beginning, middle, and end. You also want to look at how. Is this going to be done in person, through a summary report, via a press release, or will it be done through a flyer? And consider, too, with whom. Some of those with whom you likely wish to communicate include your clients, service providers, perhaps elected officials, and neighbors, and of course, all of those who participate in your quarterly consultations. While the resources you identified should be specific to the goal and the objective set, the information gleaned may well be of benefit to numerous others in your community. and sharing with them, they may feel more inclined to share future resources with you and feel a greater sense of participation in and ownership of refugee integration. As we said at the beginning, refugee integration is a dynamic two-way process that involves not only the refugees but the receiving communities. I think one of the challenges that we have faced in refugee resettlement and ongoing service provision is that at times our communities don't feel an ownership of that process, and as much as possible, we want to give that to them. So in review, and I think we're doing really well on time, actually, I'm pleased about that. In review, there are numerous advantages to community resource mapping, including the engagement of community members, cultivation of partnerships, coordination of services, and ultimately client access to available community resources. And that access to available community resources, again, all resources, individuals, institutions, networks, frameworks, that is our primary goal. To determine which community resources may be of greatest benefit to you and those you serve, first set a vision and SMART objectives. It's not helpful to take on a community resource mapping exercise where you look at all available community resources. I think it would be very difficult for you to find the time and energy and resources to take something on of that magnitude. Instead, look at what's most important for those that you serve and how that's going to help you accomplish a broader shared vision of refugee integration. And then finally, strategies to identify and map community resources include use of scans, like those that can be done at quarterly consultations, online research, surveys, site visits, and interviews. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, Switchboard has developed a new Switchboard tool, Community Resource Mapping Templates. A link to these templates will be shared with you via email at the conclusion of this presentation. And I just want to note that for those of you that are a bit wary of any online mapping tools, this can actually provide you with the tool that you need in order to lay out the resources in a very simple and straightforward way. Eventually, yes, you will need to put those on an actual map, but the templates can guide you in laying them out in a kind of spreadsheet. Other community engagement resources in which you might be interested can be found at www.switchboardta.org. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. We wanted to leave quite a bit of time for questions, and we got several on registration. And so while folks type any questions that they have at the moment into the chat, I thought we would start with some that we received from you all a little bit earlier. One common question that we had was around timing. One registrant said that it's hard to stay up to date on which organizations or partners are offering services, especially when grants and funding change. And the question there, Sarah, is how often do you recommend updating a community resource map?
That's an excellent question. You know, I think there is a difference, of course, between community resource mapping and having a list of resources that you provide to your clients. The list of resources that you provide to your clients, and these are referrals to essential service providers, that should be done on a more frequent basis. A community resource mapping exercise, though, is not one that you would want to take on, in my opinion, more than once every 2 years, in part because you're looking at specific questions. As part of the community resource mapping exercise, when you're gathering information I know that we talked about this in more general terms, but you'll see in the templates that we've developed that we want you to consider questions such as, what are the group's funding cycles? What populations do they serve? What is the geographic area on which they're focused? In doing that, you can have all of that information on file, and potentially, depending on how sophisticated the software that you're using, create a kind of tickler system that can alert you when an organization's funding is likely to change, as an example. I do think that you want to keep an eye to the information that you have pulled together. We noted that it's important to note how you are going to store the information, where you're going to store it, who will have access to the information stored. By all means, update that as the information becomes available to you, but I don't believe it's necessary to undergo a new community resource mapping process more than really as needed, and as needed is going to be defined by the objectives that you have set.
Great. Thank you for that, Sarah. Excuse me. One question from Letitia on the call who asked, does the Switchboard tool allow mapping of client addresses? And I guess in the sense of in their relationship to a specific community resource or group of resources.
That's an excellent question. No, the template is actually fairly straightforward in information gathering. However, that information, the information of client addresses, is something that you might be able to input into a more sophisticated online community resource mapping tool. And related to that, that needs to be part of that initial question of, what is your community? What area are you looking at mapping? If you want to look at only looking at the location, maybe the 50-mile radius of your resettlement affiliate, if you're working at a resettlement affiliate, then certainly do that. And then you might want to just put in the zip codes of all of your clients to ensure that they all fall there in the map. It can get complicated as some of our offices have many clients in a number of locations throughout our state. But the more defined the area that you focus on, the more successful your mapping exercise will be.
So starting to see a few other questions come in now. Thanks, everyone. Please continue to type those in. This actually goes to a point you made earlier about overlapping services. So in a case where there are many organizations providing duplicative or overlapping services, can community resource mapping be an opportunity to improve communication between those organizations?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that you will want to address as part of your analysis of the information. So you will certainly identify through the information gathering phase that you have a number of service providers that are providing the same or similar services to the same or similar populations. How you approach that conversation, of course, can be challenging. I think this is when it's really important that you identify a task force convener that is a trusted community member. Ideally, I think that your convener should not be someone, say, for example, who is one of 3 resettlement affiliate offices, all of whom are providing similar services in the same geographic area and who perhaps may on occasion be competing for funding. Instead, you might want to have the convener be a more neutral party who is skilled at helping to bring people together in conversation. But it absolutely is a very useful tool in helping to identify not only areas of overlap of services, but Also, gaps. You might find that while you have three service providers that are all doing similar things, um, none of you is doing something that is of real importance to accomplishing that objective. And that could be an opportunity then to present to a potential funder. And maybe the other two organizations would get behind the one and making that pitch.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned that because that was something that does seem to be emerging from a few folks on the line. You mentioned earlier the potential to present a community resource map to funders with an eye towards increasing funding, and given that funding has emerged as a challenge on our pre-registration survey as well, can you speak a little bit more to how to go about sharing a map like this with funders?
Absolutely. So as we said, one of the things that you want to do is actually lay the resources out on a map in a way that is visually stimulating to your audience, but you're also going to have that spreadsheet that helps you to identify gaps and barriers. Once you have analyzed your information and you're moving into the sharing phase, you need to think about how best to pull all of that information to share in a way that is digestible. When you're sharing with potential funders, it's in my opinion, one of the best things to let potential funders know, even before you embark on this process, that it's something that you're taking on. They may be willing to fund the process, but even if they're not, you can let them know that as part of this process, you anticipate identifying gaps in service and that you're eager to let them know what you found. Keep them informed of the process as you move forward. Make them feel as though they are a part of it. And then once you have identified those gaps, I would recommend doing a summary report likely for potential funders, sharing that with them and asking for an opportunity to meet with them in person to go over the results with them. Ideally, you're going to want to make certain that any gaps that you identify and present to a funder align with their funding needs, their funding priorities. You don't, for example, want to take the gap of what's a good example? Transportation services to a funder that is only interested in research. That's a very simple example, but those are things that you want to take into consideration before you actually meet with them, so that you're best using your time, limited time, and resources in making that outreach.
Great. Thanks so much for taking all of these questions, Sarah. Since we have a few minutes, let's continue to take a few more. A great question from Yara over the chat who says, can you please dive a little bit deeper into the differences between providing a service directory to clients and conducting a community resource mapping exercise?
Absolutely. So a service directory is really going to focus on all essential services needed by your clients after their arrival to the United States, and for those of you that are providing services for longer periods of time, perhaps up to 5 years, it might be a bit broader. But even then, that directory is likely not to include all community resources. And as a reminder, community resource mapping focuses on all resources that can be of benefit, including individuals. So for example, if you have an individual that is fluent in Dinka, and they're one of very few in the community that has that language ability, you might note them as a resource, but you're certainly not going to include them in a directory that's provided to clients. I would say, though, that your community resource mapping exercise likely will result in new resources that eventually are added to a directory that you can share with your clients. they're not one and the same, but one can certainly influence the other. In the same way, just as you might identify resources through your community resource mapping exercise that can be included as part of a directory, those resources that you have in your directory will certainly funnel into your community resource mapping exercise, especially if they relate to the SMART objectives that you have established at the start of the project. And I should note, too, that we've really talked about a SMART objective, but it's entirely possible that you will have several SMART objectives that you look at as you are working to achieve that broader vision. And the community resources that you identify for one objective may not be the same resources that you identify for another. It's really a way to help you focus your thinking.
Great, thanks again, Sarah. So we got a question from Jacqueline who asks, where can attendees go to potentially find an example of a community resource map that has been done in the past?
That's an excellent question, Jacqueline. Actually, I'm going to turn that question back around to the group and ask you all, are you aware of any successful community resource mapping exercises that have been done that may be available for others to review? And if so, you could just type that into the chat box. If not, Jacqueline, we'll look for that and get that to you.
All right. One question from Jamie here around what characteristics or details of the community resources are being mapped within I shouldn't say are being mapped, but are included for you to fill out within the template. I actually pulled up the template itself, so maybe it's easier for me to answer than put you on the spot, Sarah.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I figured. So under the information gathering template within this document, you have an opportunity to list the community resources. Sarah has provided several different categories of resources, cultural resources, transportation, public safety, and many others. Then you have the opportunity to list the point of contact, the mission of that organization, population served, services they're offering, whether they have stable funding, and whether there's an existing relationship between that resource and your organization. So those are some of the categories that have been pre-populated in the template, but I would imagine, and maybe you can speak to this a bit, Sarah, as well, that if there are other things you're interested in learning about the resources as part of your effort, that you can modify, again, this template and make it fit your needs.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I see that someone has shared an example, Sarah Peterson, of a collective impact project. And I just brought that up quickly. It looks like it could be a very good resource to you all as you move forward. There are obviously lots of examples out there, although there are not a great deal that are specific to refugees and immigrants. And as is the case with many exercises of this nature, different groups approach the exercise in different ways. This is the approach that I have found to be most successful and that I think speaks best to the challenges faced by those in our communities. But there are many other examples out there that you could certainly find with a quick search online. Letitia, I noticed your question. The community resource mapping is, pardon the expression, resource intensive. Yes, indeed it is. Can you address how best to develop and prioritize SMART objectives that will allow for a really useful map? That part of it is certainly a challenge. I personally find that what is most effective in developing and prioritizing SMART objectives is to first ensure that you have the appropriate people in the room. And this is why creation of a task force is so critically important. You all should have a sense through your quarterly consultations as to what challenges you are facing as a refugee service providing community. And then once you have a sense of what those challenges are, take some of those key players, bring them together, and have that conversation. It may be appropriate to use an outside facilitator in first establishing the SMART objectives and indicators. This could be someone that is different from the task force convener. It may be the same person, but I think it's very important that you have someone with strong facilitation and prioritization skills. It's also possible that once you have identified your objectives and indicators, that you want to take those objectives and indicators back to the quarterly consultations to see if they really resonate with people. It's also an opportunity for you to get more buy-in into the project and identify if there are others who have, again, pardon the expression, resources, in this case likely financial or staff resources, that they would be willing to donate to the project so that it is less labor intensive. I think too, another very exciting prospect that we have is all of these wonderful individuals that continue to approach our organization saying that they want to do something to respond to the refugee crisis. This is an area that doesn't necessarily require a great deal of expertise in the refugee space. Obviously, yes, when you're defining the objectives and indicators, you do want to have that understanding. But in terms of facilitating, you could use someone outside of the space who has that expertise. And when it comes to actually kind of pounding the pavement and gathering your information, that's where those with less knowledge of the refugee space really can be of great benefit.
Oh, excuse me, I had myself on mute. Thanks again, Sarah, for answering all these questions. I can see that we only have a few minutes left, so I may take a moment to just wrap up and thank everyone for their questions. I dropped another example of a map that I have been made aware of a few years ago into the chat if others are interested in checking it out. If we didn't answer your question, please don't hesitate to follow up with us at Switchboard. I'll show our contact information here. You can just email switchboard@rescue.org. We do have technical assistance available to all ORR funded organizations, so if you're interested in discussing this further, getting some support with this topic, we would absolutely love to hear from you and be available to talk with you more about it. You can just email us at switchboard@rescue.org. You can follow us online at SwitchboardTA, and then on our website, www.switchboardta.org, you'll find the webinar recording once we have a chance to put that together, along with a transcript and this community resource mapping template tool that Sarah developed for you all. And something I wanted to mention too is when you go ahead and close this webinar, you're going to be brought to a feedback survey. You have the link here as well, and that will also be sent over email. Please, it would be a huge help if you can take just 1 minute. It's a very short survey to fill out that feedback survey and help us improve our webinar and training offerings in the future. That's hugely helpful to us. I think with that, I may go ahead and wrap up a moment early to allow anyone who can complete that survey to take a minute to do so and then move on with their afternoon. Again, Sarah, thank you so much for joining, and thank you to everyone who has tuned in today to this webinar. I really look forward to continuing this conversation, so don't hesitate to reach back out and subscribe to Switchboard's newsletter to hear about more learning opportunities in the future.